Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are cracking open a file on a man whose name is, well, it's pretty much synonymous with the absolute pinnacle of literary achievement. Count Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy.
Leo Tolstoy, yeah.
And when you hear that name, your mind probably jumps straight to these 1,000-page novels, right? War and Peace, Anna Karenina. But the real mystery we're tackling today is the profound, almost violent internal transformation that defined the second half of his life. We're really looking at how one of Russia's most privileged aristocrats systematically dismantled his own life, his own ideology, to become the world's most radical moral reformer.
That is precisely our mission today. We've got a stack of sources here that let us move beyond, the required reading list and really trace the fault lines of this spiritual, ethical, and political revolution he went through.
A revolution, that's a good word for it.
It really was. This transformation saw Tolstoy shift from being a celebrated writer, chronicling these huge historical epochs, to a global moral authority. His uncompromising views on pacifism and nonviolent resistance, they laid the actual groundwork for 20th century leaders.
We're talking about leaders fighting for civil rights and independence across the globe.
Exactly. We're dealing with a colossal figure who basically decided his artistic genius was secondary to his ethical duty.
And the sheer volume of his output, it's just astounding. We're talking monumental novels, yes, but then you've got novellas, short stories, plays.
And these highly aggressive political arguments, polemics,
Yeah.
right? And deep philosophical treatises, and even wrote popular textbooks.
The range is incredible, but what grabs you immediately is the sheer paradox of the man. He was born into the highest tier of Russian nobility, a count with a title and vast estates, yet he utterly rejected wealth, private property, and the very concept of aristocracy.
He did. He tried to tear it all down.
And maybe even more compellingly, he was a decorated war veteran, celebrated for his courage during the brutal siege of Sevastopol, who emerged from that experience as the world's fiercest and most famous apostle of absolute nonviolence.
And that profound internal contradiction is perfectly mirrored in his literary career. It's almost bracketed by two massively different kinds of works.
How so?
Well, his career launched with his semi-autobiographical trilogy, Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth. And for its time, despite some sentimentality, it really captured the universal pain and wonder of growing up.
Okay, a fairly standard, if brilliant, debut.
Right. But later in life, he wrote the complete antithesis of that. His nonfiction manifesto, The Kingdom of God is Within You. And this later work is a stringent, revolutionary call for civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. It became a foundational text for figures like Gandhi.
So it's a moral framework for action that completely transcended literature.
Intended it entirely.
And before we unpack his life, we have to address one curious detail we found in the sources, this one concerning official recognition. We noted that Tolstoy was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature every single year from 1902 to 1906.
Every year.
He was also nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize, specifically in 1901, 1902, and again in 1909. Yet, he never won either of them. He remains arguably the most famous and persistent oversight in Nobel history.
Yeah, that's a big one.
What do you think that refusal to award him, even when he was so clearly the world's greatest living writer, what does that tell us?
It tells us that by the turn of the 20th century, the cultural establishment was just deeply, deeply uncomfortable with him.
Too radical.
Way too radical. His genius was undeniable, but his radicalism was too destabilizing. He wasn't just criticizing the Tsar. He was challenging the legitimacy of the state, the church, wealth, the very concept of patriotism.
So for a committee tasked with honoring service to humanity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For them, they had a genius on their hands who was actively trying to undermine all the existing structures of power. This rejection suggests that his role as a revolutionary moralizer actively overshadowed his stature as the greatest novelist. His political philosophy just made him too dangerous for mainstream institutional approval.
Okay, so let's unpack the path that took this count from his country estate to global revolutionary status. And we have to start at the beginning. He was born in 1828 at the family estate of Yasnaya Polyana.
Right, which is located about 12 kilometers southwest of Tula.
And this was not a humble origin by any stretch. The Tolstoy family was part of the old, established Russian nobility.
Absolutely, and it's worth dwelling on that heritage for a moment, because it's the bedrock he spent the rest of his life trying to blast away. The family's claim to antiquity was extremely important to them.
They had a whole mythology around it, right?
They did. They traced their ancestry back to a mythical nobleman named Indris, who, according to the family history that was promoted by Pyotr Tolstoy, arrived in Chernigov way back in 1353 with this substantial retinue.
So it's part history, part legend?
It is. While the first documented members only appear in 17th century records, the pedigree was firm. They were landowners, aristocrats, and inheritors of ancient Russian tradition.
But that immense privilege was quickly undercut by profound instability and loss. His youth was marked by being orphaned so early.
Tragically early. His mother died when he was just 2 years old, which is a tragedy we can only imagine the impact of. And then his father passed away when Leo was only 9.
It's just devastating.
That level of loss, especially at such formative ages, certainly contributed to his later struggles for self-definition and, for direction. He and his siblings were essentially passed around among various relatives who took on the responsibility of raising them.
And while they were never financially destitute.
No, not at all. But that lack of parental grounding, it seemed to manifest when he hit adolescence and early adulthood.
And we see that instability translate directly into his academic career. When he enrolled at Imperial Kazan University in 1844, he was supposed to be studying law and Oriental languages.
A classical path for an aspiring nobleman.
Exactly. But it seems he was entirely unsuited to the discipline.
Unsuited is putting it mildly. The official record of his time there is famously damning. His teachers found him, and this is a quote, both unable and unwilling to learn.
Wow.
He found the pedagogical methods completely stifling, the academic exercises tedious, and the whole environment hostile to what he considered genuine inquiry. So he dropped out, right in the middle of his studies, without a degree.
This wasn't an academic failure rooted in a lack of intelligence, then.
Not at all. It was a total rejection of institutionalized knowledge, which is a theme that would, of course, define his later life.
That sounds less like a budding intellectual forging a new path and more like a privileged young man who's just adrift and directionless, with ample time and inherited wealth to waste.
That's a very good way to put it. The period immediately following university is described as especially dissolute. Our sources detail him returning to Yasnaya Polyana, then spending heavy periods in Moscow, Tula, and St. Petersburg.
Indulging in what is bluntly termed a lax and leisurely lifestyle.
And that lax and leisurely lifestyle was really code for a high-stakes, high-risk existence that was, well, it was common among bored, wealthy young aristocrats. He ran up serious, heavy gambling debts during this time.
Debts that really threatened his finances and his reputation.
Absolutely. We're talking about a man who inherited a vast estate but was systematically risking it away at the card table, driven by this deep lack of purpose and self-control. It just reveals a huge gulf between the disciplined moralist he became and the reckless young count he started out as.
So how does this young man, mired in debt and dissipation, suddenly find his path?
His older brother, Nikolai, who was serving in the military, he intervened. In 1851, the idea was put forward that Leo should join him in the Caucasus, perhaps as a way to escape his creditors and find some structure.
So it was a practical decision.
A completely pragmatic decision born out of necessity, but it placed him directly on the path to military service, which became the pivotal turning point of his moral life. He enlisted as a non-commissioned officer and then quickly transitioned into an artillery officer.
And this service brought him face to face with the reality of war, culminating in the Crimean War, specifically the brutal, famous 11-month siege of Sevastopol running from 1854 to 1855.
That experience was transformative precisely because it involved such intense, close-quarters combat and really industrialized slaughter. He served with distinction. He even participated in the intense combat of the Battle of the Chernaya.
And our sources confirm he was recognized for genuine courage under fire. He even earned a promotion to lieutenant.
He was a capable soldier, no question, but the horrors he witnessed just broke him spiritually.
And this is where the great reversal starts. He was appalled not just by the danger, but by the sheer, senseless waste of human life and the mechanical indifference of warfare.
Exactly. He wasn't just observing from afar, he was a participant. The revulsion was deep, immediate, and permanent. He saw firsthand the mechanism of the state applied to mass murder.
And he left the army.
Immediately after the war ended. And that experience of Sevastopol, where his courage was proven but his moral center was shattered, became the bedrock of his lifelong shift toward absolute pacifism. He gained the moral authority of a man who fought and then rejected war, making his subsequent philosophical stance far more powerful than if he had simply been a distant intellectual.
The military experience may have disillusioned the man, but wow, it provided incredible material for the writer. That shift away from the army coincided directly with his early literary success, capitalizing on the stark realism he had just experienced.
The output was immediate and critically acclaimed. His military sketches, the Sevastopol sketches from 1855, they captured the gritty, ugly reality of siege warfare from the perspective of a man on the ground.
Which was unusual at the time.
Very unusual. This gave him instant literary acclaim, solidifying his stature alongside his earlier work, Childhood, and the Cossacks from 1863. He was now officially one of Russia's serious realist writers.
And then he achieved the monumental. We arrive at the undisputed pinnacle of his literary career. War and Peace in 1869, followed by Anna Karenina in 1878. I mean, War and Peace is so often referred to as one of the greatest novels ever written, just for its sheer dramatic breadth.
It's an unprecedented historical canvas. It combines history, philosophy, and domestic drama on an unbelievable scale. We're talking about a novel that tracks the lives of 580 distinct characters.
580, that's incredible.
It is. Weaving historical figures like Napoleon and Kutuzov seamlessly with the fictional lives of the Bezukovs and Bolkonskis, it moves from these intimate ballroom scenes to the absolute chaos of Austerlitz and Borodino.
And what's truly fascinating, according to our sources, is that Tolstoy's original idea was actually to investigate the causes and consequences of the Decembrist revolt.
Wait, the Decembrist revolt, which was the 1825 uprising against Tsar Nicholas I? So it started as a much more specific, politically charged historical event.
It did. The novel was initially intended to follow the son of Prince Andrei Bolkonsky as he became a Decembrist. But the research process was so thorough and the scope of his inquiry into the origins of the Napoleonic conflict so vast that the novel it ballooned. It took on a life of its own.
So the Decembrist revolt is only referenced
In the very last chapters. It just shows how the novel evolved into something far grander and more philosophical than a mere political history.
and that philosophical grandeur is key. War and Peace allowed him to lay out his definitive theory of history. It's this epic that argues for the complete insignificance of individuals such as Napoleon and Alexander in the face of these vast, almost accidental collective forces of mass movement.
It sounds like a philosophical rejection of the great man theory of history.
It absolutely is. He posited that history is not driven by the genius or ambition of monarchs and generals, but by the myriad small decisions and actions of millions of people. This theory is a foundational element that, prepares the reader for his later political rejection of all centralized authority.
If great men don't drive history, then why do we allow them to run the state?
Precisely.
It's brilliant, it's monumental, it's universally praised, and yet here we encounter the enormous contradiction that defines the second phase of his life. Tolstoy later rejected War and Peace, and to a lesser extent Anna Karenina, as nothing more than elitist, worthless, counterfeit art. That's just astonishing.
It is the ultimate act of artistic self-sabotage, and it was driven by this intense moral demand. After his profound spiritual crisis, he decided that the only valid purpose of art was to express universal brotherly love, or to be a vehicle for moral and spiritual utility, understandable by everyone.
And he viewed the stylistic complexity and elite subject matter of his great epics as failing that standard.
Completely. It's interesting that he did concede that Anna Karenina, with its deep focus on marital fidelity and personal morality, was closer to his ideal. He actually called it his first true novel.
I find that almost comically tragic. Here's the man who wrote what many consider the greatest work in the Russian language, yet he views it as a youthful folly.
Meanwhile, the critical world was just pouring out praise. Virginia Woolf didn't hedge at all. She called him the greatest of all novelists.
And we have that famous anecdote about William Faulkner, who, when asked to list the 3 greatest novels ever written, just replied, Anna Karenina, Anna Karenina, and Anna Karenina.
The world saw genius. Tolstoy saw vanity. Their appreciation focused heavily on his distinctive prose style, which he honed to perfection during this era. Richard Pevier, whose modern translations have brought new life to the works, points out that Tolstoy's writing is full of provocation and irony, and written with broad and elaborately developed rhetorical devices.
He managed to blend deep psychological realism. You feel like you really understand Pierre Bezukov's internal confusion or Anna's desperation with this sweeping philosophical commentary on society and faith.
And for a man who spent his life writing, he had a surprising disdain for a major literary form, poetry.
Yeah, that was very cutting.
It was. He famously said, "Writing poetry is like plowing and dancing at the same time." His critique was rooted in his demand for sincerity and utility. He criticized poets like Pushkin for using false epithets just, quote, simply to make it rhyme. He saw art as a serious ethical undertaking, not a frivolous aesthetic game.
And this demand for sincerity, for realism, for utility in writing. It really foreshadowed the complete moral upheaval that was about to rock his world. That demand for absolute sincerity and utility, it reached a fever pitch in the 1870s. This marks the transition from celebrated novelist to tormented seeker. This was the period of his profound moral crisis, a spiritual awakening so intense that he documented it in his stark nonfiction work, Confession, published in 1882.
And this was far more than an intellectual turning point. It was an existential collapse. While he was actually finishing up the final installments of Anna Karenina, a novel dealing deeply with despair, infidelity, and suicide, he was experiencing an almost suicidal anguish in his own life.
I mean, the sources note he reached such an extreme state of mind that he began physically putting away guns and ropes.
Out of a genuine, paralyzing fear that he would end his own life. The success he had achieved, the wealth he possessed, the family life he enjoyed, it all felt meaningless. It plunged him into despair.
That context is so vital. This wasn't a philosopher calmly considering an ethical problem. This was a man fighting for his soul. So what specific external forces and influences helped steer him out of that darkness and into this new, radical spiritual framework?
Well, two very different foreign influences stand out as catalysts for change. The first was purely philosophical. The German pessimist Arthur Schopenhauer. In 1869, Tolstoy recorded experiencing what he called constant raptures over Schopenhauer, finding in him a profound intellectual confirmation of his own despair.
Schopenhauer, whose magnum opus was The World as Will and Representation. That's some dense stuff. How did a deeply metaphysical critique of human desire translate into Tolstoy's practical ethical choices?
It's a great question. Schopenhauer argues that the world is driven by this restless, irrational will, an internal driving force of desire that guarantees perpetual suffering. The only path to genuine peace, Schopenhauer argued, was through the denial of the will.
Which you could achieve through aesthetic contemplation
Or, and this is the critical part for Tolstoy, through ascetic morality. Complete denial of self, voluntary poverty, self-sacrifice. He cited figures like Buddha and Francis of Assisi.
Yeah.
Tolstoy took that metaphysical denial and applied it as a practical social imperative. He concluded that the moral obligation for the rich upper classes was to adopt this self-denial and voluntary poverty.
That provides the intellectual root for his later wholesale rejection of his own aristocratic status. But the second influence was far more visceral, shocking, and it happened much earlier.
That would be the public execution he witnessed in Paris in 1857. This experience wasn't intellectual, it was raw trauma. He was deeply horrified by the state-sanctioned murder, seeing the mechanism of government applied for the purpose of killing.
And he wrote about it.
He did. In a letter to a friend shortly thereafter, he wrote that the experience solidified his total permanent rejection of state violence and any form of political service, stating, "The truth is that the state is a conspiracy designed not only to exploit, but above all to corrupt its citizens. Henceforth, I shall never serve any government anywhere."
Wow. That one horrifying moment essentially laid the ideological genesis for his entire anarchist, anti-state platform almost 20 years before his spiritual awakening formalized it.
Precisely. And armed with this clarity, the Schopenhauerian asceticism providing the ethical how and the execution providing the political why, he articulated his specific, highly stripped-down Christian beliefs in what I believe in 1884.
He wasn't interested in theology or miracles.
No, not at all. He sought a literal, ethical interpretation of Jesus' teachings, centering almost exclusively on the Sermon on the Mount. He wanted a faith he could actually live.
And his entire new philosophy hinged on that famous central commandment from Matthew 5:39. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also.
That phrase, which he interpreted as non-resistance to evil by force, became the absolute bedrock of his doctrines of pacifism and absolute nonviolence. He also deepened this conviction through corresponding with American Quakers who introduced him to the writings of George Fox and William Penn, further bolstering his nonviolent convictions.
For Tolstoy, if Christ meant it, it must be taken literally.
Absolutely. Any use of physical force by an individual, or more damningly, by a state, was a direct betrayal of true Christianity.
And this emphasis on a stripped-down, purely ethical, anti-state Christianity inevitably put him on a collision course with the institutional Russian Orthodox Church.
Irreconcilably so. He viewed the church not as a keeper of faith, but as a political instrument that had perpetuated a perversion of Christ's original revolutionary teachings.
He argued the church had corrupted the message by embracing rituals, seeking temporal power, and worst of all, endorsing state violence, the military, and the absolute authority of the czar.
Yes, he believed that true and lasting happiness came only from striving for inner perfection and loving one's neighbor and God, rather than relying on external guidance or authority from either the state or the church.
And that stance led, quite predictably, to the ultimate symbolic rejection of the establishment. His formal excommunication from the Russian Orthodox Church in 1901.
It was inevitable. His novel Resurrection directly attacked the church's rituals, and his tracts challenged its core doctrines. The church, which was heavily intertwined with czarist authority, could not allow a man of his stature and popularity to continue asserting that they were fundamentally misleading the populace.
The excommunication served as a clear warning to others, I imagine.
It did, yet it also cemented Tolstoy's status globally as a fearless moral dissident. He had literally been exiled by both the literary and the religious establishment, which only increased his credibility among the common people and international thinkers.
So the next stage of his life solidified his identity not just as a writer or a Christian, but as a full-fledged radical philosopher. His rejection of state and church institutions ultimately made him, by definition, a nonviolent and spiritual anarchist.
Indeed. His political development was heavily shaped by direct engagement with contemporary anarchist thought. He had traveled and met with the French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon back in 1861, primarily discussing educational theory.
And later he engaged with others.
Oh yes, he later engaged deeply with the works of the Russian revolutionary anarchist Peter Kropotkin. The resulting ideology, Christian anarchism, was just uncompromising in its critique of centralized power.
And his definition of the state is brutal. He viewed it openly as a conspiracy designed solely to exploit and corrupt citizens based on organized violence.
He used incredibly provocative language. He called the state the domination of the wicked ones, supported by brutal force. For him, government was simply institutionalized criminality.
Is that famous quote?
Right, he was often quoted asserting, robbers are far less dangerous than a well-organized government because the state's violence is supported by legality, patriotism, and religious sanction, making it far more insidious and destructive.
And his followers, who began to call themselves Tolstoyans,
led by his confidant Vladimir Chertkov, they formed to propagate these radical religious and political teachings.
Yet, even as an anarchist, he had a crucial, non-negotiable disagreement with other anarchists regarding the method of achieving anarchy. Most anarchists advocate for revolution.
And that is the essential dividing line. While he fully agreed with their sharp critique of the existing social and political order, he sharply criticized their willingness to use violent revolutionary means to overthrow it.
For Tolstoy, violence only replaced one form of domination with another.
Exactly. Anarchy could only be instituted through a permanent moral revolution, what he termed the regeneration of the inner man.
So he believed political change had to be a personal, spiritual transformation first.
Precisely. In his 1900 essay on anarchy, he maintained that while anarchists were right in their negation of the state, they were mistaken in thinking revolution could achieve true anarchy. True statelessness, he argued, would only be achieved when people gradually chose not to participate in or require the state's protection or authority.
His vision required millions of individual moral choices, not a single violent uprising.
It did.
This insistence on nonviolence is perhaps his most enduring global contribution. His ideas on nonviolent resistance, outlined most forcefully in The Kingdom of God is Within You from 1894, had an almost immediate and massive international impact.
The best and most historically significant example, of course, is his direct influence on Mahatma Gandhi. Their correspondence, which lasted from 1909 until Tolstoy's death in 1910, is one of the great ideological exchanges of the 20th century.
Gandhi was a young lawyer then, practicing in South Africa.
He was, and he read Tolstoy's Crew, a letter to a Hindu, and subsequently reached out to the Russian sage.
What did that letter contain that so resonated with Gandhi?
A letter to a Hindu was an uncompromising argument against British rule and the violence used to uphold it. It asserted that British power rested entirely on the submission and lack of moral resistance from the Indian people. It was a call to spiritual awakening and non-cooperation.
And Gandhi saw the kinship in their beliefs.
Immediately. He acknowledged his immense debt, calling Tolstoy the greatest apostles of nonviolence that the present age has produced. He was directly inspired to establish the Tolstoy Farm in South Africa for his followers.
That philosophical debt flows directly down the 20th century, right through the American Civil Rights Movement.
Absolutely. Tolstoy's nonviolence served as a philosophical blueprint for Martin Luther King Jr., who studied the concept of non-resistance. It also influenced other key figures like James Govell. These thinkers adopted and adapted the ethical foundation established by Tolstoy, proving that his spiritual anarchism could be operationalized into a method of mass political action that transcended religious doctrine.
His pacifism was also intensely anti-imperialist, which gave him the authority to condemn virtually all modern state wars and conflicts.
He used his vast global platform fearlessly. For instance, he wrote the Epistle to the Chinese people, denouncing the intervention by the Eight-Nation Alliance, which included Russia, in the Boxer Rebellion. He also condemned the bloody Russo-Japanese War.
He did not reserve his criticism for distant foreign powers. He went after his own government.
He went so far as to accuse his own ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, alongside Kaiser Wilhelm II, of Christian brutality for their actions in China. He specifically cited the looting, rapes, and murders committed by the Allied troops during the suppression of the rebellion, calling the intervention terrible for its injustice and cruelty.
This wasn't armchair philosophy. This was a direct political challenge to the heads of state, and he was fully aware of the consequences.
And he didn't just write critiques. He actively supported those who embodied non-resistance in their lives. He became a major advocate and fundraiser for the Doukhobors, a pacifist religious group in Russia.
This was after they burned their weapons in protest in 1895.
Yes, a powerful public act. After that, they faced severe persecution from the Tsarist regime. Tolstoy helped bring international attention to their plight and crucially aided their eventual migration to Canada, providing the moral and financial support necessary for them to establish a life free of the violent state.
So we have Christian ethics, we have nonviolent anarchism, but late in life, Tolstoy took on a very specific, practical economic philosophy, Georgism.
From the American economist Henry George.
Right. This seems like a surprisingly technical layer to add to his otherwise spiritual radicalism.
But it was the necessary practical application.
Yeah.
Tolstoy had long identified the fundamental economic evil underpinning the aristocratic system he despised, private property and land.
Which was the main non-productive source of income for the Russian aristocracy.
Exactly. Georgism provided a nonviolent, revolutionary economic solution. Henry George argued that while people should own the fruits of their labor, the land itself, all natural resources, should not be subject to private ownership, as it was created by God or nature for everyone.
So Georgism proposes a single tax on the rental value of land,
Which essentially abolishes the economic profitability of mere land speculation and removes the basis of aristocratic power, ensuring equal access to natural resources without state seizure or revolution.
That perfectly aligns with his goal of dismantling the aristocratic system without resorting to violence.
Precisely. It was a nonviolent method of fundamentally restructuring wealth distribution, making it the perfect economic fit for his Christian anarchism. He was utterly dedicated to promoting this idea.
He said something like, people don't argue with it.
They simply do not know it. And it is impossible to do otherwise with his teaching, for he who becomes acquainted with it cannot but agree. He believed it was an unassailable truth that simply needed dissemination.
And he incorporated this specific economic doctrine directly into his creative work.
He did. He wove Georgism into his last major novel, Resurrection, in 1899. The protagonist, Dmitry Ivanovich Nekhlyadov, undergoes a transformation that includes realizing the immorality of land ownership.
And this book, which functioned as a critique of man-made laws in the church, was one of the major direct causes for his excommunication.
It was a total published rejection of the economic, legal, and religious pillars of the Tsarist state.
That drive for reform also extended into practical education. After serfdom was abolished in 1861, Tolstoy didn't just philosophize, he returned to Yasnaya Polyana and founded 13 schools specifically for peasant children.
These short-lived experiments were crucial precursors to modern democratic and progressive education. He outlined the principles in his 1862 essay, The School at Yasnaya Polyana, emphasizing student freedom and the importance of allowing the child to define their own path of inquiry.
And they were shut down.
They were. They faced harassment and were eventually shut down by the Tsarist secret police. But they are justly claimed as the first examples of a coherent theory of democratic education, foreshadowing later efforts like A.S. Neill's Summerhill School. For Tolstoy, education was an essential tool for the regenerated inner man needed for anarchy to thrive.
To truly understand the intensity of this radical shift, we have to look closely at his personal life. The gap between his aristocratic reality and his ethical ideals created immense tragic tension, especially in his marriage. The private life of the public revolutionary was constantly on the bunk.
His marriage to Sofia Beresonya in 1862, when she was 16 years his junior, it reads like its own novel. Initially, their partnership was the bedrock of his literary success.
Sonia was essential.
She was. She acted as his secretary, editor, financial manager, enduring the arduous task of hand-copying the notoriously complex drafts of War and Peace multiple times so he could continue editing and provide clean, final versions to the publisher.
Yeah.
Her labor made those monumental works possible.
So she was literally the intellectual and logistical bedrock of his genius. But our sources describe their later life as one of the unhappiest in literary history. What caused such a complete collapse?
The conflict was driven entirely by his increasing, uncompromising radicalism. As Tolstoy sought to fully embody his ascetic morality, he tried repeatedly to renounce his inherited and earned wealth.
And crucially, he attempted to renounce the copyrights on his most famous and lucrative works.
Yes. And for Sonia, who was raising their surviving children and managing their vast, complex estate, this attempt to unilaterally impoverish the family, to essentially dissolve their financial security, it created a severe, unbearable, and ultimately irreconcilable tension.
He was ethically pure. She was practically responsible.
A perfect summary.
And that leads us back to the earlier point about his mental state. That detail about him putting away guns and ropes while finishing Anna Karenina out of fear of killing himself, it just illustrates the depth of his internal suffering.
It does. This wasn't merely a philosophical disagreement with Sonia. It was an existential war he was fighting within himself. The sincerity of his moral philosophy was validated by the physical and mental anguish it caused him.
And this commitment to his ethical philosophy drove radical changes, not just in his politics, but in his day-to-day habits, particularly regarding his relationship with the natural world and animals.
We know he was a passionate outdoorsman. He was introduced to hunting by his father and was a passionate huntsman for decades, actively including hunting scenes in War and Peace.
He was a typical aristocratic huntsman, shooting everything from ducks and quail to otters.
And yet, sometime in the 1880s, driven by his burgeoning ethical philosophy, he stopped. Completely. He wrote a preface for an anti-hunting pamphlet in 1890, confirming his new staunch opposition.
He saw killing animals for sport as an unnecessary cruelty.
It violated his principle of universal love. Though in a classic Tolstoyan contradiction, it's noted that he never gave up his love for vigorous horse riding. He still enjoyed the physicality of the animal, just without the violence.
And this concern for animals translated directly to his plate through his eventual conversion to vegetarianism.
This was a long, gradual process, beginning around 1882, but by 1890 he adopted a strict vegetarian diet that he was alleged never to have consciously violated.
And he pursued this for purely ethical and spiritual reasons.
Exactly. He argued that abstaining from meat was linked to high moral views on life. He viewed meat eating as simply immoral because it involved the unnecessary cruelty of taking life.
Was there a specific moment or catalyst that solidified this commitment for him?
Yes, there is a memorable and very vivid detail he shared. In his introductory essay, The First Step, he recounted witnessing a cruel experience at a slaughterhouse in Tula. The visceral experience of observing the mechanized, cold-blooded killing confirmed his belief that meat eating is simply immoral, as it involves the performance of an act which is contrary to moral feeling killing. He refused to be complicit in that organized violence.
And his diet became increasingly restrictive as his moral demands intensified, going far beyond mere vegetarianism.
He was aiming for austerity. By 1903, he had removed eggs from his diet after a friend questioned whether eating them constituted taking life. He wrote to a Dutch medical student that his health had improved significantly since he gave up not just meat, but also milk, butter, and eggs, alongside sugar, tea, and coffee.
So what was he eating?
His later diet consisted primarily of simple whole grains like oatmeal porridge, kasha, which is buckwheat, whole wheat bread, and vegetable soups. He fully committed to the austerity he preached, insisting that the physical body should mirror the spiritual purity he sought.
This overwhelming tension between his ethical ideals and his opulent reality. It finally came to a dramatic and world-captivating head in the circumstances surrounding his death. At the age of 82, driven to distraction by the conflict with his wife over the renunciation of his wealth and copyrights, he made a final, desperate moral break.
He secretly left home.
He just left. A dramatic exit designed to live out his final days as a true pauper, unshackled from property.
And he died only a few days later from pneumonia on November 20th, 1910, at Astapovo railway station, after a brief, brutal train journey south. His health deteriorated so rapidly that the station master housed him in his small apartment where he soon expired.
Just imagine that scene. The most famous living writer in the world, the Count who authored War and Peace, running away from his own life only to die of exposure and pneumonia in a rural railway station, surrounded by reporters and onlookers who were captivated by his final moral act.
It was a global media event. It attracted reporters and cameras from all across Europe. And even in his final moments, our sources note that he reportedly spent his last conscious hours preaching the core tenets of his final philosophy: universal love, absolute nonviolence, and Georgism to his fellow train passengers and anyone who happened to be nearby.
It was the final testament of the apostle.
It really was.
His funeral reflected both the massive public impact he had and the caution with which the state viewed this charismatic dissident. 2,000 people attended, but at the family's request, there were no eulogies or formal speeches.
And despite that request for silence, the entire event was marked by a quiet, pervasive police presence. The Tsarist regime was clearly terrified that this enormous gathering of mourners, many of them peasants and followers, would transform into a massive political demonstration against the state and its authority.
So the burial itself, under the trees at Yasnaya Polyana, remained silent, simple, and anti-clerical.
Exactly as he wished.
His complex legacy proved particularly volatile in the years that followed, especially with the rise of Bolshevism and Soviet Russia. The Tolstoyan movement, championing nonviolence, anti-urbanism, and opposition to the state, was fundamentally at odds with communist ideology. How did the fiercely anti-state moralist become the Soviet Union's best-selling author?
It was a fascinating act of ideological co-option. His daughter, Alexandra Sasha, whom he named heir to his works to ensure they were published cheaply for the Russian people, alongside his editor, Vladimir Chertkov, they faced huge resistance from the new regime.
But the Soviets recognized his immense popular appeal.
And his usefulness as a critic of the aristocracy and the church, so he was selectively rehabilitated.
Right.
In 1928, an agreement was reached for the publishing of a monumental 92-volume collection of his works, and over 400 million copies of his works were eventually printed in the Soviet Union. He was repurposed.
How did they manage that?
Anatoly Loncharsky, the head of the People's Commissariat for Education, gave a major speech during the 1928 Jubilee celebration attempting to reconcile Tolstoy with the communist state. Loncharsky praised Tolstoy's love for equality and his disdain for wealth, the church, and private property.
But conveniently minimized his fiercely pacifistic, religious, and anti-patriotic sentiments.
That's the tightrope walk. Praising the revolutionary spirit while discarding the revolutionary method, it was essential for the state, especially as they geared up for later conflicts.
They even had a literary historian write a biography trying to convince people that Tolstoy would have revised his views for World War II.
Yes, Nikolai Gudzi argued that Tolstoy would have revised his pacifistic and anti-patriotic views had he lived to see WWII. The regime needed to neutralize his anti-war message. Even as a state, Yasnaya Polyana, which was briefly allowed to exist as a commune for the Tolstoyans, was eventually taken over by state commissariats and turned into a more controlled museum.
Interestingly, his impact was felt just as strongly by the Bolsheviks' ideological opponents as their proponents. Vladimir Lenin wrote several essays on Tolstoy, acknowledging that his powerful hatred for feudalism and capitalism marked a necessary prelude to proletarian socialism.
However, Lenin's praise came with a sharp rebuke. He focused his critique on Tolstoy's core concept of non-resistance to evil. For Lenin, this pacifism was exactly why the 1905 Russian Revolution failed.
He argued the movement was not militant enough.
Right, he said it allowed the autocracy to easily crush it. For Lenin, Tolstoy's philosophical consciousness was simply not fully developed for a revolution that required violent, decisive action.
And in stark, almost poetic contrast, Gandhi confirmed the direct transformative debt he owed to Tolstoy's understanding of Christianity.
That is the ultimate global legacy of Tolstoy's moral vision. Gandhi's Gujarati word for his nonviolent movement, satyagraha, which translates to firmness in truth, was birthed directly from Tolstoy's idea of truth as universal love, rooted in his literal reading of the Sermon on the Mount. It defined the method by which India gained independence.
And finally, his moralizing novellas, which he later prized over his epic novels, they endure strongly in popular culture.
They absolutely do. The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which captures the protagonist's intense personal crisis and search for truth, has been adapted repeatedly, most famously by Akira Kurosawa as Ikiru in 1952, and more recently as the 2022 film Living.
And of course, the dramatic circumstances of his final, anguished year of life, the flight, the conflict with Sonia, were captured in the 2009 film The Last Station. His life, like his books, remains profoundly dramatic. So, What we have explored today is the astonishing duality of a man who was simultaneously an aristocratic literary genius and a revolutionary moral reformer. His life path led him from chronicling the vast chaos of the Napoleonic Wars in War and Peace to dedicating his final decades to spreading the simple, uncompromising message of non-resistance in the kingdom of God.
Is within you.
It was a complete, decades-long rejection of the material world and his own literary fame in pursuit of a pure, unassailable truth.
His entire life, especially the second half, became a dramatic and ultimately tragic struggle to align his personal actions and his vast inherited wealth with the uncompromising ethical ideals he derived from his literal reading of Jesus, exposure to Schopenhauer's asceticism, and the specific economic principles of Henry George.
He was striving for a radical internal perfection, believing this moral revolution was the only honest and permanent path to lasting social change. A stunning story of conversion, contradiction, and global consequence.
Indeed. And for our closing thought, we have to return to that fundamental contradiction we discussed earlier. Although Tolstoy himself rejected his great realist novels like War and Peace and Anna Karenina as nothing more than counterfeit art, considering them inferior in utility to his political and religious tracts, consider this. Did the power and realism he mastered in his fiction, the ability to show the horrors of war, the complexities of human motivation, or the falsities of aristocratic society, did that actually give his later philosophical works the global authority and weight needed to influence transformative figures like Gandhi? Was the depth and credibility of the artist absolutely essential for the eventual impact of the apostle? That's something to continue thinking about as you reflect on the scope of Leo Tolstoy's radical life.